questions until the end, unless it's a quick one. So I came up with this title for my talk, Unconfusing Fall Warblers. I thought it was a clever made-up word, but turns out there really is a word, to unconfuse. So it's a real, I didn't know that until I made it up. And we're going to talk about fall warblers. This is a group that intimidates a lot of people, and I think a lot of people have misunderstandings about. And I'm going to try to help clear up some of those misunderstandings. And along the way, I'm going to pick on a person who I idolize. And that person is the god of birding, Roger Tory Peterson. And I'm going to argue that in Roger Tory Peterson's famous A Field Guide to the Birds, Peterson was wrong. And in fact, I think Peterson cursed this group of birds with this plate in his field guide and his use of this word, confusing fall warblers. The first edition of this book was published 90 years ago, and today you almost can't hear the word fall warblers without confusing in front of it. Peterson has so much impact on the lexicon of birding that this phrase, confusing fall warblers, has stuck in all of our brains and has really, I think, changed our minds. And I swear he did this plate trying to make these look more similar than they actually are. And so one of my arguments is going to be, there are a couple, I would call them challenging pairs or triplets of birds here, but most of them are not that confusing. And I think that I hope to elevate your confidence in going out, because I think looking for fall warblers is one of my favorite types of birding. You know, we all have this thing about spring warblers, oh, the beautiful spring warblers, you know. And yeah, but there's a lot going on with fall warblers. So why do we care about fall warblers like this magnolia? They're beautiful birds. They're not all dull green. They don't all look like impidnex flycatchers. They're beautiful birds. Yes, some of them don't compare to the spring version, but they're still very beautiful birds in their own right. This fall magnolia is a beautiful bird. There are many more birds in the fall migration. All the birds we saw in spring migration went up to the boreal forest and they duplicated themselves. They had babies. So those babies are coming south. So there's a lot more birds because these birds reproduced. Also, most birds tend to use an inland route in the spring, tend to use a coastal route in the fall. And so here we are stuck on the coast. We see many more birds here in the fall than we do in the spring. And in fact, without the right wind conditions, spring migration in Delaware can be pretty dull. We had a couple of bad years a few years ago. But usually in fall, there are many, many more birds. Fall migration, it lasts a lot longer than spring. Spring warbler migration is maybe 2.5 weeks, and there's maybe 3 or 4 really good days in there. And you know, if you're working or have a commitment, and you hear about the 24 species that Andy saw in White Clay Creek, you're like, oh geez, I wish I'd been able to go out that day. But in the fall, you've got practically 4 months. I mean, really the peak is from about late August to about late September, early October. The peak is right now, actually. In fact, tomorrow night is predicted on Birdcast to be a pretty heavy night of migration. But the birds are not as much a hurry. In the spring, they've got to get to the boreal forest, they've got to breed, they've got to molt, they've got to migrate south. So they're in a big hurry. But in the fall, yeah, we'll get to the wintering grounds eventually. There's a greater chance for rarities in the fall. There are more birds in the fall, and this is because young birds tend to wander off course. Case in point, about 2 weeks ago, Greg Goff found the first state record Townsend's warbler at the point at Cape Henlopen, which is the 38th species of warbler for Delaware. So it's a greater chance for rarities. They're also more easily observed. Okay? When you think about spring warbler migration, you think about warbler neck. Oh, there's a Blackburnian. They're way up in the trees. In fact, a really good example of that is that I have exactly one good picture of a spring Cape May warbler, and I have a couple dozen of fall Cape May warblers. And why is that? Well, it's because they choose different habitats. In the spring, the birds have elevated hormone levels, and their search image is for their breeding habitat, which is the canopies of trees and tall trees. But in the fall, those hormone levels have gone away. They're now looking for wintering habitat, which is brushier, edgier habitats. And so you have a much better chance to see these birds at eye level. You don't have so much of a problem with warbler neck in the fall as you do in the spring. And for me, I like identification challenges. I admit, if all 38 of them were impossible to identify, they look like impidnex flycatchers, that might be a little much. But there's enough challenge here to make it interesting, I think. So I'm going to walk you through the fall warblers, and I'm going to try to convince you that they are not confusing. In fact, what I'm mostly going to confuse you of is if you're familiar with spring warblers, you know most of these already. So the keys to identifying fall warblers, this is the theme of my talk that I'm going to hit over and over again. They aren't that different between spring and fall. In fact, almost half of them are identical in spring and fall. And so, and the others have a very strong resemblance. This is a black-throated green warbler. Yeah, okay, it doesn't have a black throat, but otherwise it looks the same as it did in the spring. Many of these birds have the same pattern. Several of them have strong behavioral cues. Those are still present. So it's not as big a deal as our friend Roger Torrey tried to make it out to be. So to help you deal with these species, I've divided them into 3 groups that are somewhat arbitrary, and you might put them in different categories than I do. But of the 27 species, there are 12 that I will argue are identical in the fall. In fact, these are some of the most common fall migrants. They look the same in the spring and fall. For another 8, they're just faded versions of what they looked like in the spring. They've been through the washing machine too many times, and they're just faded out, but they still look basically the same. And then there are the fun ones. There's a few that do look quite different in the fall, that do really present a challenge. So I'm going to run through these 3 groups and talk about how to identify the birds in them. The first group I am going to go through kind of quickly because they're very similar to their spring selves. And again, if you know spring warblers, you should know what these birds look like. But let's start with this first group then. Oh, before I get to that, these I consider to be southern warblers, and I'm not going to talk about them, mostly because I didn't want to have the 2-hour version of this talk. But the other thing about these birds is they don't change very much seasonally. This is a yellow-throated warbler, males, females, spring, fall, they always look the same. And because many of these depart very early. Louisiana water thrush is probably our earliest migrant. They're probably gone by July, by the end of July. And I've actually never seen a Kentucky warbler in fall migration. Never really heard of them in fall migration. So these birds really, I'm not going to consider. So let's start with these birds that look the same, the ones that you should be familiar with. Okay, I'm glad to hear some people talking up. For those of you who know these birds, I'm not going to put the name up here right away. So if you think you know them, you can treat this like a quiz, and I'll reveal the name at the end. But a lot of people forget this is a warbler, but it's common in spring and fall. It's common in the summer resident. It has this black bordered rusty crown patch, an eye ring, spotted breast, and it's one of the 4 warblers that walks. And as most of you already told me, this is an ovenbird. Common fall migrant. They don't sing in the fall. They have a very distinctive call. It sounds a little bit like a brown thrasher to my ear, kind of chuck, chuck sort of call. So nothing confusing about this bird, I don't think. Most of you knew what it was. Most of you probably know what this is. Similar bird to an ovenbird, but it has this pale eyebrow. I call this a streaked breast. And it has a very distinctive behavior of constantly bobbing its tail up and down. This is a northern water thrush. This bird is easier in the fall than it is in the spring. Because with spring migration, we'd have to be talking about all the little details to tell you this is northern and not Louisiana. You see this bird in the fall, don't worry about Louisiana. They're northerns. If you're on the breeding grounds for Louisiana, they might linger in into August. But if you're out just doing general birding, you see a water thrush in September, it's a northern water thrush. Here's one of our most beautiful birds. A lot of people are excited to see this in the spring. This photo was taken not by me. There are a few of these I didn't have good pictures of, and I'll put the name of the photographer on here. This is a bright yellow bird with a dark eye line. It also has these white wing bars. This is a blue-winged warbler. Males, females, spring, fall, they look the same. These really pop in the fall, especially with these beautiful colors. This is one of our confusing fall warblers. It's a boldly striped black and white bird that behaves like a nuthatch. Everybody knows the perfectly named black and white warbler. There's nothing else like this. And this is one of the, I would say, the second most common fall warbler that you see is black and white warbler. I'll be honest, the males do look a little different in the spring. They have the black throat and the black eye patch. But there's still no other black and white striped bird like this. Okay. And I'll give you one little clue. They're also the only birds that have these black spots on the under tail coverts. So if you're looking up at them and you see those spotted under tail coverts, you know this is a black and white warbler. Well, this might be one of those confusing birds. Okay. But it's not a confusing fall warbler, because this bird looks like this 12 months out of the year. Males and females look the same. Immatures have a little bit brighter yellow on the throat, but year-round, all the time, this is a very plain greenish warbler. And this is what everybody thinks all fall warblers look like, but they don't. Okay, and this could be a spring warbler, and really, this is all you need to identify this bird. There's no wing bars, no real marks at all, maybe a little bit of an eye line, very sharp bill. And the key character here to note is the fact that it has a short tail with these white undertail coverts. And this is a Tennessee warbler. And it's really the only bird that is this plain and greenish like this. Oh, except for this bird. But there's a cheat code for this one, and that's the fact that this is a very late migrant. Typically showing up here, I mean, some show up in October, but really November, December. They stay through the winter. Most year listers like me expect to find one in January. And even though this looks a lot like a Tennessee warbler, they actually don't overlap in time. Most of the Tennessees go through in September. These guys are a few weeks later. But if you need some field marks, this bird has more eye arcs, this incomplete eye ring, than the Tennessee. And the clincher here is the yellow undertail coverts. Tennessee has white undertail coverts, but this orange-crowned warbler has yellow undertail coverts. And that's, if you think of a really late Tennessee in November or something, you really better note the undertail coverts if you're going to try to argue that you found a late Tennessee warbler. Here's another fairly plain warbler. It's in the same genus as these other two. It's a plain warbler, but it doesn't strike you as greenish the way the other two do. This one has, what really hits you about this bird is a complete eye ring. And I read a great description somebody had in their eBird report of this eye ring. They said it looks like a white wall tire. And because it's complete, uninterrupted, it's uniform all the way around. If you're old enough to remember what a white wall tire looks like, that's a helpful remark. But when you see this bird, you're always hit by this eye ring. But then you need to note that it's entirely yellow underneath, and especially it has a yellow throat. Okay. And the fact that yellow throat, complete eye ring, bright yellow underneath, tells you this is a Nashville warbler. It's actually been a kind of a good fall. I've seen more Nashvilles than I usually see. But we will come back to this bird because, as a lot of you probably know, eye rings are big in fall migration for reasons we'll get to in a little bit. So we'll come back and revisit Nashville. But really, this yellow throat, yellow underparts, complete eye ring, nothing but also the very sharp bill. Another good mark for Nashville. This is our commonest bird, maybe. You know, I've had Bombay Hook eBird reports where people have reported 60 of these on their eBird checklist. And the males are completely obvious, but what I really want you to note is the underparts. We have yellow undertail cover, then we have tan or grayish here, and then we have a yellow throat. On this female, we have the same sort of thing. We have yellow throat, tan, and then this one doesn't, this is immature, doesn't quite have the yellow undertail covers. But it's these underparts that are going to be really important in not letting this bird fool us as it's prone to. And the main thing about this bird, again, very well named, it has this really broad wedge of yellow on the throat. A lot of birds that have yellow throats have a little narrow patch of yellow, or something. This bird has a big wedge of yellow that's like a 90-degree angle at the top, goes down onto the chest, and it's always the brightest part of the bird. And this is the very well-named common yellowthroat. Okay. And these look the same year-round, except in the fall you see mature males. But I don't think these are going to fool you, because they still show some of the mask. But these guys are a little tricky. This broad wedge of yellow, though, it's going to tell you that that's a yellowthroat every time. But we will come back and revisit these when we get to the eye-ring section of the talk. Yeah, okay. Otherwise, confusing fall warblers. This one has the behavior of opening and closing the tail, flashes these spots at you all the time. This is an American redstart. And these they're about 10 or 20% of the birds you see in the fall look like this. You still see adult males. I would argue this is our most common fall migrant. Some days over half the birds I see, warblers, are American redstarts. And sometimes if you just see this part of a peeking out from behind a leaf, you get a little excited, but you don't have to wait very long for it to jump around and show you the tail spots. So you've got tail spots, you're good on American redstart. Another bird, very pretty bird. Come on, this is not a dull fall warbler. It has these big white wing bars that hit you between the eyes, these big white eye arcs, do the same thing, a bright yellow throat. And this is the female, a bluish warbler with these marks. This is a northern parula. Same marks on the male, but the male you still see males in the fall with this breastband. This is a third or fourth most common fall migrant. So black and white, American redstart, parula. We'll get to magnolia. I think that's the fourth of the really common birds. In fact, right now, they're about the only things I've been seeing recently. So not a challenging bird, I don't think. You know, what can I say? There's nothing that looks like this bird. Okay, very well named. The females, on the other hand, can be quite challenging. They do strike you immediately as being very drab overall, but they usually have these double lines on the face, and about 80% of them have this white handkerchief, it's called, these white spot at the base of the primaries, and those marks tell you this is a black-throated blue warbler. My experience may be less common in the fall than they are in the spring, but you still do see these guys in the fall that are obviously perfectly named black-throated blue warbler. And then the last bird in this group, it's a small yellow bird with a crown patch. In the males it's black, in the females it's green. This is a Wilson's warbler. And in fact, these guys are really tiny. I mean, this is one of our smallest birds, I think, period. And again, they're bright yellow all over with the crown patch. Okay, so we're almost halfway through these birds, and we haven't had a lot of confusion yet. We'll get to some confusion in a minute, but that takes care of this first group. Now we'll look at this second group. And here I'm going to show some pictures of spring birds so you can see the similarity between the spring and the fall birds. And we'll start, and in general, these birds have been through the washing machine about 50 times. Okay. And what that means is that red, orange, and bright yellow become pale yellow. And it means that black becomes gray. But for all of them, we're going to see the same pattern. I'll tell you what this bird is in a little bit, but it's the fall version that has the same pattern as the spring one, and we'll get to that one. And some of these do have behavioral cues, and those are constant. So here is my one good picture of this bird. Very beautiful spring warbler, tiger striped breast, chestnut cheek patch, yellow neck patch. This, of course, is a Cape May warbler. One of the more sought after spring warblers, especially because they're really responsible for warbler neck. This is the only one I've ever seen below about 50 feet in the spring. And bay breast is the other one. I have no good pictures of a male bay breast in the spring. But here's the male in the fall. We know that the chestnut cheek patch has been washed away, although you do see a few in the fall that have the chestnut cheek patch. Still has this tiger striped breast, still has the yellow neck patch, still very much a Cape May warbler, very similar to the spring version. But a lot of the Cape Mays we see in the fall are immatures. This might go into a little bit confusing fall warbler category, but they are actually very distinctive. They don't have the chestnut cheek patch. Most of them don't have the yellow neck patch, but they still have this striped breast. And it's extensively striped all the way across the breast. Most of the other warblers will have a little streaky on the side or up at the chest, but these birds are striped all through the breast. So they hit you as a gray warbler with an extensively striped breast. And again, they're pretty distinctive. Not really anything else that looks like that. This is an immature Cape May warbler. And so you kind of see everything between this bird and the last bird in the fall, but they always have this extensively striped breast, which is what I really cue in on for Cape May warbler. All right, this is the spring warbler that everybody wants to see. It has this retina-searing orange throat. And the problem here for fall is that you never get past this orange throat. You're so mesmerized by it, you just can't believe this throat. So that's all you look at. But there's a really important pattern here that we have this black cheek surrounded by orange that creates this big orange eyebrow. And that's the same pattern we see in the fall. So this is a Blackburnian warbler, probably most of you know. Here's a fall Blackburnian. Same pattern, just yellow and gray, not black and orange. So instead of an orange throat, we have yellow. Usually these are pretty bright. There are some dull ones. And we have the gray cheek patch completely surrounded by yellow. And again, when you see this bird, it hits you as a yellow-throated bird with a big, broad yellow eyebrow. And there's really nothing else like that. Okay? So this is a fall Blackburnian warbler. And I think, again, if the spring bird didn't exist, we would think this was a really beautiful bird. But it doesn't have the retina-searing orange throat, so I guess it's not. Another pretty easy one. This is an all-yellow bird. Every feather is yellow. Except for these chestnut streaks on the spring males. And this, of course, is the appropriately named yellow warbler. It is yellow. Okay. We get to the fall version, the chestnut streaks are gone, but it is still an all yellow bird. Every feather is yellow. Okay. And sometimes they're duller than this one. If you ever see one of these, you're wondering a little bit about this bird. It's the only bird with yellow tail spots. So if you can see underneath the tail and you see these yellow tail spots, those are diagnostic by themselves for yellow warbler. They also have an eye ring. It's not that obvious on this individual, but again, we're all primed looking for eye rings in the fall, and a dull yellow might fool you every once in a while. And this is a beautiful, complete white wall tire eye ring. So be cautious about the eye ring on the yellow warbler. This is a spring version of one of our most common birds. We can't see the classic field mark for this bird, but even in this view, we have a white throat, dark cheek, and these yellow wing pits tell you this is a yellow rump warbler. Most of the time, the yellow rump is pretty obvious, like it is on this fall bird, but if it's not, white throat, dark cheek, yellow wing pits. Just more faded. And on top of that, this is one of the few warblers, along with western palm warbler, that we'll get to in a minute, that really hits you as a brown bird. Most of the other warblers are gray and greenish and those colors, but myrtle, sorry, show my age, yellow-rumped warbler, I still call it short-billed marsh wren. Yellow-rumped warbler is a very brownish bird, and again, it's a late migrant. I can see a lot of these right now, but in another month, they might be our most common warbler. That brings us to this bird, which I just mentioned. This is the spring version. This is an easy warbler because it's just a bright yellow bird that constantly wags its tail. This bird, it's all about the behavior. It just constantly wags its tail. And so, I saw one a week ago, it was way up in the tree, and I went, what is that? And, oh, it's a palm warbler. Tail just started wagging. In the fall, it's just a little faded. It does have this rusty cap in the spring. In the fall, it's just a pale yellow bird that constantly wags its tail. It does have a little bit of the rusty crown patch and the supercilium, but again, the behavior of this is so distinctive and so unique that usually you don't have to get much further than that. But in the fall, we have a little extra complication. This is a yellow palm warbler, or an eastern palm warbler. In the fall, about half the palm warblers you see actually look like this. And this is a very brownish bird. We do have but it's a brown bird that constantly wags its tail. And the only other brown warbler is yellow-rumped, and it never wags its tail. So the tail wagging just gives these guys away all the time. This is a western palm warbler. Again, my experience about half and half in the fall. If you need a supporting field mark, these bright yellow under tail coverts on a brown bird. It's sort of the inverse of the yellow-rumped warbler. You have the yellow under tail covered warbler. Can give you a little help. And this pale supercilium is also fairly distinctive on the head for western palm warbler. Again, this bird can be kind of late. They do overwinter in small numbers. So you can see these throughout the fall and into the winter. It's one of my favorite warblers. I did my undergraduate thesis on this particular bird. This is the spring version. We have a bright yellow breast with black streaks, 2 black streaks on each side. And we have this very unique face pattern, which I always have a hard time describing. But, because I see this as 4 semicircles, yellow, black, yellow, black. But this little black mark here on the shoulder is really unique to this species. And this species also wags its tail, but not like a palm warbler. If you've been watching a bird for a minute and all of a sudden it wags its tail, maybe that's a prairie warbler. If you've watched a palm warbler for a minute, it would have wagged its tail 10 times already. So this is a prairie warbler, and this is a spring male. But you do see these in the fall. I had one at Ashton Tract a few days ago. Looked just like this, with a black face pattern. But most of the ones we see in the fall are immatures, and they look like this. But we still have the yellow breast with the side streaks. It's not as black. And we still have this unique face pattern with this little indentation of yellow and a second semicircle of black there. It will still wag its tail occasionally. So it's still pretty easy to call this a prairie warbler. For some reason, this is one of my favorite spring warblers. This is bright yellow face, black throat, black-throated green warbler. In the fall, all that's going to happen is we're going to wash away that black throat. And it's going to look like this. So we've still got the yellow face, still got the white throat. It's still a black-throated green warbler. And nothing else really hits you as a bird with wing bars like this that has a bright yellow face. And all of them in the fall still have this bright yellow face like this. So again, almost everything else has a yellow face, has a yellow throat or yellow underparts. And you will see birds in the fall that have some black on the throat, probably the immature males. But a lot of them look like this, with some little bit of streaking. One secret field mark here is this yellow stripe on the vent. I used to live in Arizona where this was a mega rarity. And to prove this wasn't a hermit or Townsend's warbler, we had to see this yellow stripe on the vent. That's diagnostic for black-throated green warbler if you're ever worried about that one. come on, we all know what this is. It's got this black necklace. No other bird has this beautiful black necklace. It also has the plain gray upper parts, no wing bars. It's really bold eye-ring. This is a Canada warbler. In the fall, very similar looking bird. This time we've got a gray necklace on the yellow breast. I've never seen one without the necklace. They get pretty faint like this bird. Still have these plain gray upper parts, still have the bold eye-ring. Still look like a Canada warbler. I mean, again, until we get to group 3, I'm going to argue, I don't think these birds are that confusing. So I hope if you've been a little intimidated about going out and looking at fall warblers, you now realize that you can identify a lot of them. Okay, so now we get to the fun ones. And again, I don't want to call these confusing, I'm going to call them challenging. And the first one we're going to talk about is the holy grail of fall warblers. And I wanted to make sure I gave you an accurate representation of how they look in the field. This would be considered a good look at this bird. Well, let's look at a little better picture of one. This one can be challenging to identify, and actually more challenging than I thought a couple weeks ago. And I've spent a lot of time looking at pictures of these 3 birds we're going to talk about. But the thing that's really unique about this bird is this really extensive tan, buffy, or maybe a little bit gray hood. It goes all the way down to the center of the breast and has the sort of this con-color head that usually has the throat and the hood the same color. We usually have a complete eye ring, but this is the field mark that's always touted on this bird. But what's going on there? I mean, that looks a little broken to me. And it's rare, but they do occasionally have a little break in the eye ring. But usually it's pretty obvious, the white wall tire eye ring. And this has entirely pale yellow underparts, which is important. And this is, of course, the sought-after Connecticut warbler. Okay, we're really looking at this extensive. Oh, and the other thing is this, along with the water thrushes and the ovenbird, is the only warbler that walks. So if you're lucky enough to see this and you wonder what it is and it walks down the branch, you're done. Okay, that's diagnostic for Connecticut warbler. But again, sorry, wrong button. It's really this extensive tan hood. I mean, when they peek out from the underbrush, they sometimes almost remind me of house wrens. Just that uniform brown head sticking out there. But there is some variation, and that's, of course, what makes life fun. I wanted to show you a couple of other pictures. Here's another Connecticut warbler. And I want to point out this bird does have a buffy throat. It does contrast with the rest of the hood. This is not that unusual, but the key point is here it's buffy, not yellow. And the throat color is going to be really important for separating Connecticut warbler from its lookalikes. Okay? So they do occasionally have this buffy throat, and this bird has a beautiful, complete eye ring. There's a little tiny break at the back there, but has this buffy throat. The other thing that's often touted for Connecticut warbler is this rear end look. It shows these ridiculously long undertail coverts. These are probably the longest undertail coverts of any bird. They probably cover 80% of the tail. And in fact, when banders have a Connecticut warbler, the main thing they do is measure this distance between the end of the undertail coverts and the tail. And that helps to separate this bird from mourning warbler, which is the main confusion bird. But I was looking into this a little bit. And there's the undertail coverts of a mourning warbler. I took this from eBird, forgot to write the photographer's name on here, but this was a spring male mourning warbler, so I know it was identified correctly. I mean, sorry. You're better than me if you think you can tell that apart in the field. Mourning warblers have a really long undertail coverts as well. Not as long as Connecticut's. Again, a bander that can actually measure them, or maybe in a photograph, you could separate those, but boy, they're awfully close. The bird that really falls out here is the western McGillivrays warbler. It has very short undertail covers, and that's one of the key marks. If I don't think that's ever been, no, it has not been ever seen in Delaware, although it's been seen in some of the surrounding states. So the undertail coverts, I'm not convinced. Again, a bander, sure, but in the field, maybe not. So why am I showing you this Connecticut warbler? Yes.
Yellow throat.
It's got a yellow throat. So what does that tell you? Well, we can do the Socratic method here. I love that. Connecticut warblers do not have yellow throats. In fact, it wasn't until I took a photo of this bird. When I saw this bird in the field, I thought it was a Connecticut warbler. But it has bright yellow underparts. I think these are lemon yellow, but I'm terrible at describing colors. But it has sort of a gray hood, but just kind of the remnants of it. And it has this yellow throat and this yellow line here. That's actually the supraloral. And now the question is that an incomplete eye-ring? Well, in the front it's probably broken. In the back it's not really broken. This is a mourning warbler, first-year mourning warbler. And when you get the yellow throat, you're done with mourning warbler. Okay, that really does separate it. But if you get some of them have gray throats. Sometimes you see adults in the field. They can be tricky. You know, the standard field guide will tell you it's complete eye ring versus incomplete eye ring. This is a bird that looks more typical. Okay, this is the incomplete eye ring. You see white up here, white down here, gray across the middle. It's got these nice double eye arcs. I've seen 2 mornings this fall, and both of them had beautiful incomplete eye rings like this, thank God. But this bird I found several years ago and really got me thinking about how hard these birds are. And a great way to look at something like this is to use eBird. And you go to the eBird homepage and click on Explore, type in mourning warbler, takes you to a page, you scroll down the bottom, there's the pictures, you click View All. And now you're presented with every mourning warbler photograph ever submitted to eBird. And you can sit there and flip through hundreds of them. And this is a really good way to appreciate the variation. And I did this with mourning warbler. And you know, this is not that unusual to have these nearly complete eye rings in mourning warblers. So this pair, definitely, I think we're still figuring out the best way to tell them apart. Again, this bird has a yellow throat, this bird has a yellow throat. They're not Connecticut warblers. And Connecticut always has that extensive hood, goes all the way down to the middle of the breast like this. But mourning in Connecticut, they're rare. Again, everybody that wants to see a Connecticut warbler, the minute you see anything that looks like a complete eye ring, you know, all your senses are buzzing. But you got to be careful with these guys. Well, here's a complete eye ring. Get you excited? What's the problem with this one? I swear, about every fall, I'm the eBird reviewer for 2 of the counties in Delaware, I get reports that this is a Connecticut warbler. Because the eye ring, it's a dull green bird with a complete eye ring. Come on, it has to be a Connecticut warbler, except the underparts are not entirely yellow. And it has this big, broad wedge of yellow on the throat. Okay? Which means if I get an eBird report of the Connecticut warbler, it's got to mention the throat. Throat color is really important. This is a common yellow throat. And I was lucky to I wanted a picture of one with a complete eye ring, and I got this about a week ago. And I was like, oh, great. I'll show this one. But it's a good example. Again, that a lot of this kind of looks like mourning or Connecticut, but a big, broad wedge of yellow on the throat. The brightest yellow is always on the throat. Common yellow throat. Another one of those eye rings. So we've got the complete eye ring here. And this throat color is kind of ambiguous. Sometimes they can be gray in this particular bird. Now you're thinking, well, well, wait a minute, the yellow upper breast. Again, Connecticut, big hood here, wouldn't have this yellow upper breast. So complete eye ring, yellow underparts. This is the Nashville warbler that we saw earlier. This is a first-year bird, and again, sometimes they have grayish throats, so you have to be a little careful. But the hood on a Nashville is always confined to the head. You always have this breast that's yellow. A little patchy sometimes in the first-year birds. So hopefully that'll help you with the eye-ringed confusion birds. Here's a bird you can't really confuse with anything else. This is one of our most beautiful spring warblers. David Sibley claims it's his favorite bird and put it on the cover of the second edition of the Sibley Field Guide. This bird has a combination of bright yellow underparts, some variable side streaking, wing bars, and an eye ring. With those three things, you're done. This is a magnolia warbler. Okay. And we see a lot of these. This is the other of the four birds that I consider really common. Really pretty. I mean, this is a really bright yellow bird. Again, the spring bird makes this one not look that exciting, but by itself, I think it is. And of course, magnolias have this really unique tail pattern. If you ever see one that you're kind of confused about, the tail looks like it's a white tail dipped in ink. And this is pretty obvious in the field if you're looking up at the bird. So that's always something to keep in mind. Another fall warbler. This one has a behavioral cue, and that's this cocked tail. They always have a cocked tail. They always have this tail up in the air, and usually the wings drooped a little bit like this. And usually that alone is enough to tell you what this is, but they're sort of bright green on the back. They have a complete eye ring and a gray face. And I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about this gray face that contrasts with the green cap here. But this is a wing-barred warbler. This is a fall chestnut-sided. I do want to mention a few fall chestnut-sideds do have color along the flanks, the chestnut color. So you will occasionally see ones that have some chestnut on the flanks. But most of the time it's a bright green bird with wing bars, a cocktail, eye ring. Usually jumps out at you, I think, pretty well. Now this is the last three I'm going to talk about. This is probably what Peterson had in mind when he coined the term confusing fall warblers. Yes, these are three different species. They can be a little bit challenging, but let's walk through these three. They all have wing bars. No really bright colors on them anywhere. So how do we tell them apart? Well, the classic two field marks you look at with these are whether or not the back is streaked and what the foot color is. Oh, you get a kick out of that one. Luckily, the foot color is always obvious. Sometimes the leg is involved too, but I'll give you some other clues besides that. But here's the first one of these birds. Streaked back, dark feet. That tells you this is a fall bay-breasted warbler. And this does look the females look a little like this in the spring, but it certainly doesn't look anything like a male in the fall. But notice about 80% of them, I would say, have this hint of pink color on the flanks. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing that always hits me about bay-breasted warbler is they're really clean-looking birds, especially on the head and breast. And they're often kind of lime bright green on the head. This one, not the brightest I've seen like that. And sometimes people mistake these for chestnut-sideds because of the bright green, because of the little color on the flanks. But no complete eye ring and not that nice contrast between the gray face and the gray underparts and the bright green back. So this is not a chestnut-sided warbler. This is a fall bay-breast. And this is the one that most people confuse with bay-breasted warbler. Can't see it very well here, but it does have a streaked back, and it has these beautiful yellow feet. And sometimes the entire leg is yellow. See any yellow on a bird like this on these feet, and that tells you this is a blackpoll warbler, one of our more common fall migrants. And again, the females look a little like this in the spring, but this is nothing like the black and white spring blackpoll that we see. But, you know, if you're not able to see the feet, what else do you have going for this? Well, compared to bay breast, this bird, strikes me always as more yellowish. Bay breasted are sort of greenish. This bird is more yellowish. And it usually has some sort of messy streaking, particularly on the sides of the upper breast like that, which bay breast rarely has. So yes, it's a very similar bird, but you see enough of them and you do start to be able to tell them apart, even when you can't see the feet. But the feet are always great because you're like, once you see the yellow feet, you go, okay, I know this is a blackpoll. Now I should look at the other marks and sort of become familiar with them. And this is our last bird. And for me, this bird is the, what the heck is that bird? Whenever these pop up, that's usually what pops into my head. What the heck is that? A boring tan bird with wing bars. But anytime I tell myself, what the heck is that? The next thing I think of is, why isn't this a pine warbler? Because that's what this is, the first year pine warbler. Okay? And it has the unstreaked back. And that by itself is going to tell you this is not a blackpoll, it's not a bay breast. And again, they tend to be sort of this very boring tan, sort of grayish tan color. They still do have the spectacles like the adult birds do, and they have this gigantic bill, which also helps identify pine warbler. This is a big bruiser of a warbler. This is, say it's our biggest warbler. I think I'm correct now that we don't count chat as a warbler anymore. I think this is our biggest warbler. It's a big bruiser of a warbler. It's kind of vireo-esque in some of its appearance, but it doesn't have the hooked bill. It doesn't have the blue-gray feet. And in the fall, we do see adult males like this one, the yellow spectacles, the yellow breast, wing bars. You know, yellow-throated vireo is really the only thing you're going to mistake this for. And pine warblers almost always have some streaking that the vireo never has. And these birds are really variable. You can see anything between these two, and we often see them in molt because they do breed here. And so you can see sort of a patchwork of these two birds. So whenever I see a bird that's like, what the heck is that? If you find yourself saying that, or some other version of that phrase, immediately think of pine warbler. They said, why isn't this a pine warbler? All right, so the conclusions here are, don't let Peterson intimidate you. I think you overestimated how confusing these birds are. I really don't think they're that confusing. And when you're birding in the fall, draw on your knowledge of spring warblers. See a bird, ask yourself, what does that remind me of? You know, a fall Cape May, a fall black Burnie, a fall black-throated green. They're all going to remind you of their spring versions. Embrace the challenges. You know, that's part of the fun. If you could identify every bird every time you saw it, you know, what would the fun be? And part of that is don't be afraid to let some go. Okay, experts do this probably more than amateurs do it. Just say, well, yeah, I didn't get a good enough look. You can always blame it on the look you got. Yeah, it wasn't a good enough look. I'm not sure what it was. But yeah, some of them will be, what the heck is that? And they won't be pine warblers. So, you know, don't be afraid. Don't let, you know, particularly get over this intimidation, because these are some beautiful birds. There's lots of them. There's lots of places that you can find them. They're much more widespread, I think, than spring birders are. And so I think hopefully this has helped you get over, break Peterson's curse. Remember to have fun. Sometimes I need to have that talk with myself when I'm getting frustrated. But here's a bird I didn't talk about. This is a cerulean warbler. Very rare, but I got a photo of one, so I had to put it in here somewhere. So again, if you want to email me here, feel free to take a picture of the slide or write it down. I'd be happy to send you a copy of this PowerPoint. And with that, I thank you for your attention and happy to answer any questions.